Welcome everybody to this first session of this course, which is supposed to be a course, interactive course. That's why we have a small lecture hall where we can have a lot of discussions. And I thought we can get started with that almost right away. And this course you will have 3 different lectures. So it's me, and I'm Thomas Björklund. Welcome. Missed the best seats, but that's because you're late. Okay, excellent. So, yes, as I said, I'm Thomas Björklund, and I run a research group on this floor up in that part, which is called molecular neuromodulation. And we work with gene therapy in Parkinson's disease. And I will be sort of your main host of the course and take you through some of the practical details on how to get software up and running, how to start working with Illustrator mainly, and some other of the practical things. And then you have 2 other lecturers, one that is Ludwig, who is focusing on type. Came down. Okay, so Ludwig is a guy working on some very classical design, and that is the design of fonts. So he's designing new fonts, and he's doing that for newspapers when they are moving from an old typeset to newer ones, online systems and other things. So he'll talk about how to work with the layout, working with text together with the images. And then next week, you will get Jenny Wallis as well. And she's from London, and she is the art editor of Nature Reviews Neuroscience. So each of the Nature Review journals have their own art editor who is doing a lot of the illustrations and making them fit into the scheme of nature so it looks the right way, and also making the high-quality illustrations for all the review articles. So she'll be here to talk about both her work there, and also she's a trained artist, so she'll talk a little bit on what she does also on her spare time. But today, so just to give you a short overview of the schedule as it looks right now, the idea is that, of course, this course is not meant to have many hours to fill some kind of slot. It's not that type of course. So we want to be as optimized as possible in this. And this may mean that sometimes, if there are not many discussions, some sessions will be a little bit shorter. So I hope we can have it more flexible and in that way make it more efficient, because we want to make it worthwhile your time to be here. So that's the main goal. And of course, fill it with things that you are interested in. So if there are things that nobody is interested in, we shouldn't go through them, just sort of because. So that's why it's very important with the interaction, that you tell me what you want to cover, and we'll try to fit that in. And that will come also in the end, that you can bring up questions that you feel has not been covered during the course, and then we can make sure to put that into that last session. And the other thing is that it's very important when you learn these type of tools that you use them right away. It's not good to have a course where you learn how to use Illustrator and then you don't use it for a couple of months, and then when you sit down again, you think, how was this actually done? So that's why we have put in 2 things that you are supposed to do yourself, training between the 2 weeks. And it's only 6 days, and that's made by design, because if you feel that you have multiple weeks, at least I would not get started until the last week, but I would then feel the pressure to have accomplished something that is much greater because I had all that time. So the idea is that we have short enough time to get started and doing these assignments, but not enough time to feel that you have to present something that is sort of overly ambitious. It should be 2 focused things. And my other quest with these assignments is that they should be things that you would want to do anyway. So you wouldn't have to do this just to hand them in here. You want to also be able to use them. And we'll get into details about those 2 assignments later on, but one is focusing on learning how to use Illustrator and make an overview figure that you would want to use in a review article. It could be in a PowerPoint presentation, something like that, that presents one aspect of your own research. And the other assignment will be to create one panel that is meant for a poster. And this is for you to get into how do I import data from all the analysis equipment I have in the right way. So I get vector graphics from my qPCR machine, I get the right images, the right quality from my Western blot, from my microscope, and getting those together in a multi-panel image, and also get some text into it. So you get some value of working with text, working with images, and then working in InDesign. So you can think about the assignments being one for Illustrator and one for InDesign. And those assignments you will then have to hand in on Sunday at the latest, and then we will discuss those on the Tuesday. So we will have the display of those during coffee so everybody can see what the other people have done. And we'll go through this. It's not that you have to show secret data. You can anonymize that so you don't feel that you're displaying things that are in progress. But they will be on display during coffee, and then we'll have Ludwig and Jenny coming back, and we'll go through and we'll all discuss these things. What things work and what things don't, and why do some things look better and are more clear in the illustration. So that is where we'll end up. So my hope is that you all feel at the end that you can manage these two applications. You see how they fit together in the workflow, how you get data in, how you get it out. And those are things that we'll also cover. How do we export things for publication, to optimize for the newer digital formats of publication? And how do we export it to present well in our presentation? But of course, starting with that in mind, we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So we all come in here with very different experience. So some of you probably have worked with Photoshop a long time and feel that you could do everything in Photoshop. And others are more, have never touched any of these software, do your posters in PowerPoint. And so we need to bring everybody to the same page. And that means that some of the things I'll go through may be a little bit fundamental and easy for some of you, but I hope I can go through that quickly. And then tomorrow, I'll help those of you that do not have the Creative Suite installed on your computer to get that installed and get up and running. And this means that those of you who have a full installation of the Creative Suite can actually come a little bit later tomorrow morning. So the idea would be that we spend the first 45 minutes with those people that do not have it installed, getting that in. Can I just see who has not the Creative Suite installed? Good. And who has it but not the latest version, version 6? Okay. So the thing is like this, that we have got money to give you all a full license of this software. So which is normally costs about 2,500 each. So you can feel, even though you may have it installed on one computer, you can actually get a second license to install on a home computer or whichever you. So you can all just come, if you want that, just let me know tomorrow as well. But for all of you guys, just, if you can, it helps to bring a laptop for tomorrow morning. Is somebody who does not have a laptop that they could bring? Oh, that's good. So we can all have that part of being hands-on installation, because that helps if you have the software available. And then from that point onwards, feel free to have your laptop and be able to test the things that I talk about, because it can be a good thing to just test that while I'm discussing. So you can bring those, and I'll try to bring tomorrow extra extension cords so you can get power. Was there a question? Yes. No, but I'll make sure that we have those in, I hope, because they should be. Yeah, there are some outlets. I'll bring that together. Another thing is that these lectures they are recorded. So I've put a small camera here and I'm recording the sessions on the computer. So I'll try to, as soon as possible, put them up on the joint folder that I sent out to you. So you can look at things in retrospect and see some technical details there. So you don't need to sit and make a lot of notes, because making notes on how to find things in software are normally useless. You then read it and it doesn't make sense. So it's often quicker just to go through this video tutorial and find that specific part. So they will probably come out in sort of first unedited, just so you can have it during this week, and then it will become a little bit higher quality after the course when I have some more. Bring those. So, and then we'll try to go through in sort of increasing complexity of things, and some of the more fancy things that you may not use as much will come in the end. So you can see more what's the possibility of these software. What can you actually do? But let's get started now. So we have, the first session will be until 2:30, or a little bit earlier, but coffee comes at 2:30. So that's where we have our, yes. Yes, that was a typo. Sorry about that. It is, no, it is tomorrow afternoon. That was good that you mentioned that. So I put an updated version on the net today, but that's, thank you. So first I wanted just to sort of start to put you in a mindset of what is digital imaging. And digital imaging today is all about ones and zeros. And these ones and zeros are making up everything that we acquire and put together. And it's done in a way that we can represent a lot of different measurement parameters in one unified digital format. And this is a concept that we today take for granted, that of course we can make sound into data, we can make, of course, images, we can make then everything that we measure can be made into data. But it was done, actually, the concept was brought up in the 40s by this guy, who is a very unknown guy, but his work is quite amazing when you think about when he developed these concepts. And he developed all of these concepts at the Bell Laboratories in the States. And his name is Claude Shannon. So he wrote this technical abstract around the theory of communication. Because until that point, everything that was communicated was analog. So there wasn't the concept of being able to bring something analog into something digital that you could transfer and then recreate the original source. So for example, when you think about sound, of course we have sound waves that propagate out in the air, but then you can actually bring those down and you can analyze all that sound. So this is then a sound wave you see like this. And then you can chop it up into small pieces. And when these small measurement pieces are small enough, you can actually start to just give them a measurement value. And then all of these measurement values can then be brought back together, and you can do a digital to analog conversion and make the sound again. And this is what we always use now in our cell phone communications, in our MP3 songs, and everything like that is just making that sound wave into all of these small containers of measurement data. And that can then be represented as a long binary number, which a computer can store and bring back again. So this is really the key concept we use for everything that we do in illustrations, in sound, and in also coming more and more now into 3D, and we will also in the future also be able to store in tactile information and maybe even also smell, so at least analyze smell and bring that into something that can be analyzed digital. So then when we think about images in our research, images are not only things that we can see ourselves. Sometimes you think about it, well, you can take it with a camera, but we nowadays can make images of almost anything. So if you think about one of the most standard things we do is a Western blot. And then in this Western blot, of course, we make an image out of it in the end, but what you're actually taking in that Western blot is just the number of photons that is emitted here. So this is a luminescence Western blot, meaning that the number of photons that this reaction is emitting is directly proportional to the amount of that protein you have in there. And this is of course, in one sense, you would never be able to see this with your bare eye because it's just so low intensity that we can bring it up with high sensitivity CCD cameras. We can start to see it. But in that way, of course, there has been photons from the start. But that's not always the case. You may think of making images from your flow cytometer, and those have very different representations of each pixel intensity, or you may have radioactive decay and other things that you will never be able to see with your eye, but you can represent them as images. But it's always important to think about what am I actually showing in an image? Because sometimes you think that it's a real photograph, but actually the source of it is nowhere near the real photons that you would see in that photograph. And the example of that is confocal microscopy. And it's easy to think that that's a normal photograph, but it's actually a computerized simulation of something. You measure with a laser scanning through, and then you build that image in the computer. So the image as you see from a confocal has never existed. You could never capture that on a photographic film. But we can still show it as a digital image. And this is why I bring this up, is that it's such an important thing when you think about research ethics. So what can I do with an image and what can I not do? And all of what spans in that is dependent on how you generate the image. So taking something where you take away all the background in your confocal before you acquire it may be just as wrong as doing it afterwards. But you feel that it's more wrong to do it afterwards because you have seen what's there before. But you always have to think about this. What are my controls? How can I show that this is actually representing the world? It's not saying that this is the raw image because there's no such thing in confocal microscopy. It's always this digital computed image. But you have to make sure that you know what's been done before to know that what I'm taking in my control image is the same as I take in my active group when you compare. And that's the same thing in most of these measurement tools that we use. But it's easy to forget about it and just say, anything I do until I get that image is fine, and then what I do afterwards, I have to be careful. But actually, you have to think about that whole process from the start until the end. And it's the sum of all these changes that can bring image from being totally acceptable and correct to something where you start to be in the gray zone. So I'll try to help you how to think about this and to minimize many of these pitfalls. The other thing that you have to think about is how do we represent color and what is actually color? So when we see a white light, as you all know, white light is this composite of the whole spectra in the rainbow that we see. And this prism here can, of course, be a raindrop, and that's why when we see a rainbow, but also in this case, it's a glass prism. And then every wavelength has its own color that we see in our eye. And the color that we see is very different from all the other animals. So some animals see infrared, and some animals do not experience green in the same way as we do, and so forth. So we always need to know that color for us is something very different from any other species. And this color that we see is made in a color system called the additive color space. And additive color space is something that light can do when you bring it together. So when you bring together the colors red, blue, and green, and you put these filters on top of each other and shine light through it, it becomes white in the middle. And you have yellow there. And so you see all of these colors. And actually, just these three principal colors in the additive color space can make up almost all the colors that our eye can perceive. So this is the additive color mixing. But if you think about then painting with crayons or other things that we do on a paper, you know that when you mix these colors, they don't become closer to white. They become darker and darker, and in the end you will get something that almost looks like black if you mix all your possible colors. And that is another color space, and this is called the subtractive color space. And sometimes this is sort of counterintuitive. This would be you add colors and they become darker. That, at least to me, would be more logical to be called the additive. But that's not the principle here, because you have white as the higher numbers and black as the lower numbers of your image. So when you see these two, of course, they are tricky to show on a projector like this, because the projectors use a mix of the additive and the subtractive color space. Your computer screen is completely additive. So that's where you can get the best colors. But from this type of projectors, they use another type of coloring. That's why you also don't get those super crisp colors. Your yellow here is a bit dim compared to what it looks on the screen. It's brightly yellow on the screen, but it doesn't look that on this projector. And this is the reality we have now, that our images will be shown on 3 different media, we can say. We have our computers or our smartphones, which is additive color space. Then we have these projectors that is a mix of the two. And then we have the printed, which is then subtracted. And this is important because some of the images we generate are beautiful on our computer screens. We sit, especially on your confocal or fluorescent microscope, you sit in a dark room, look at these brightly shining neurons in GFP, and then you try to print it. And you get it published in your journal and it just looks dim. And you need to know why this is and how we can work around it in the best possible way. But it actually is not always possible to get all the way when it comes to printing. But you need to know that the best you can do when it comes to representing the visual field is the additive color space. But when coming to this one, you see when you mix these 3 principal colors, you have cyan, magenta, and yellow, you see that those 3 together make something that is grayish. It isn't pitch black. And that's why we actually have a 4th color there, which is called key. And why it's called key is that the black in every image has the detail in it. So in the printing presses, where these 4 colors are used, you use the black to align the other colors. So it's the key for alignment. And that's why that color is. So taking these 4 colors together, you can then start to generate something that is almost the same color space as the additive. And why do I call this color space? Well, it is because when you try to show all of them together, you bring them out into this 2-dimensional array. And the sort of horseshoe-shaped one behind here is trying to simulate what colors our eye can perceive. And that's, of course, impossible to do on a projector because everything else has fewer colors than our eyes can. Even if it's the best computer screen, it is this triangle that is here. So it doesn't cover all of this field, but it actually has some parts that our eye cannot see also. But in sum, it's smaller than the total field of color. And then you have a normal computer screen, which is the one in here, and you start to see that what you lose is the really rich colors in the edges, which cannot be shown by a projector like this. Because this projector is rather like the sRGB in here. So it's an even smaller triangle of colors that it can show. To make matters worse, then, this part here is the subtractive colors. And you see that you lose all the rich greens and the really deep blues in the printing. And those are the colors that you really lose a lot. The red you lose much less of. And that's why, actually, it's a funny story about the guy that developed green fluorescent protein. When he had his C. elegans on the cover of Science, the printers, the art editors there, called him up and said, the green that you have in this worm, we cannot print it. Can we switch it to red? So they wanted to print that, the GFP in red, but he pushed back. So in the end, it was green, or as green as they could print it. But it's good to know that red will always look very nice there. And that is a challenge for us when we present our triple colored panels in. So you normally think about this, The Adobe RGB here is roughly a normal computer screen, and this is the print. So we want to make sure that when we work with our images, we work with them in as large a color space as we can. Because then we know that we are always optimizing it for the best possible viewing experience. And then there will always be cases where you need to lose quality, and that's when you print. But printing today is such a small part of the whole communication of science. So it will be interesting to talk to Jenny if she has statistics about this, but I would expect that 95% of all people that read your paper will read them from a PDF and not from the printer. Unless you publish in Science or Nature where people have subscriptions, most journals we buy electronically. So that means that you can actually reach your customer, so to say, in RGB space. You don't need to go to the printed CMYK. They can see your original data. Yes. Yeah, they are a bit special. They are, in the way, I'm not sure if everybody knows this e-ink technology, where you actually have small beads with black ink inside. And they are charged, so you can put one charge on it and the white side of them turn up, and the other one is black. So they are very similar to a printing press in that way. And they also, because they are lit from the top, not lit from the back. Not yet. There are some versions they are trying, but I would expect that they would have to be the subtractive. So speaking about this, going from RGB, which is this additive color space, red, green, and blue, to the subtractive CMYK, can have a dramatic difference on how your image looks. So this is, again, a bit tricky to show on a projector, but this is one simulation of how that would look. So this is just the same RGB image converted into the CMYK. And as you see, this is not how we experience the cells when we look in our fluorescence microscope. So this is really a place where you don't want to go to unless you really have to. And journals earlier asked you to convert all your images to the CMYK before you publish them. And some still do. But my recommendation there would be to push back from your side, to not submit them in this color space. And it has two reasons. One is, as I said before, that most of your readers of the articles will still view them on the screen, and they would appreciate seeing this image much more than they would want to see this. And the second one is that as the subtractive color space is smaller than the additive, you throw away a lot of information from here to here that you can never recover. So you can never bring something back from this to here, but you can always generate that from this image. And you want to generate this in the last possible step. And even for the printers, it's better that they do it when they know their printing presses, instead that you do it beforehand, because then you have to have a generic conversion, and it's never as good. So try really, until they won't accept it, to send it in RGB, because it will be the best result. It saves them some time. That's why they ask you for this conversion when they do. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So what you can see in the additive is that the cyan, magenta, and yellow are in these borders between red, green, and blue, red, and blue, green. So they are actually the primary colors are well preserved. So yellow is beautiful in a printing. So and that's a bit vicious on when you do double staining and you have red and green. The red will show up rather nicely. Green will be super dim. And then as soon as they overlap, they will be super shiny yellow. And sometimes that's what you want, sometimes it isn't. But it's not predictable in that sense. But yellow and red are good and all, yeah, the primary colors of the printing press. So the next detail I wanted to bring up is resolution. And this is one of those discussions and things you had to think about a lot earlier on, because the computers were so slow that we had to, and the storage capacity was limited. So you had to make sure that you never used more resolution than you needed in the end. Nowadays, this is not a big issue because just storage is cheap and computers can handle big images. So the key today is to make sure that of two things. One is that you capture your images in the optimal resolution for your capture device. To not do oversampling, so meaning that you acquire more data than the equipment can actually generate. And sometimes you can do that, and that's called interpolation. And you just add some extra softness to the image. You don't add any data to it. So you want to avoid that from one end. But on the other end, you want to make sure that you capture enough information so that if you repurpose the image, you have enough data in it. And the example is, of course, when you come and produce an image for your Nature paper, you get it sort of stamp-sized 2 by 2 centimeters, and you scale it for that. But then you want to reuse the same image for your SFM poster or somewhere, and you want to blow up the same in a 30 by 30 centimeter image. And it's very much a pity if you don't think about the multiple purpose of your image from the start, so that you can use the same data for both of these concepts. And that I'll try during this course to help you how to make sure that you keep all data also when it comes to resolution. And why can this be tricky? And it has to do with the way our computer screens display our images. So a computer screen itself has a very limited resolution. So if you would go up, and even this projector, it's rather high resolution projector, but still, when you stand close enough to it, you see the pixels in it. And you do this because the computer screens cannot have the same resolution as our eye has, and it also doesn't have the same resolution as the best printing press. So we want to make sure that you have more data than you can show on the screen. And this is an example of this, that the right image here is optimized to show on this projector. And that means that if you go and look at this very closely, the right one here actually looks crisper than the left one. But the left one has much more information in it. So you see this is 20 times larger in size, meaning that it has 20 times the information in it. But still, the right one here looks sharper on the screen because it has been scaled down to have every pixel in the image is exactly the pixel on the screen. This is, of course, fine if the only thing you want to do is to use this image for presentation in a PowerPoint or Keynote. But if you want to zoom into regions of this, you start to see that the content of the information is, of course, much higher in the left one. So you see this is one of the dendrites sticking out when you see the spines, versus on the right one, you just have these big pixels. And that makes a difference when, when you want to print it. Because printing, we try to optimize it for the resolution that our eye can see on a reading distance. So our eye does not have pixel resolution. It has degrees of viewing angle that it can separate. So the closer they are, the closer, of course, the pixels have to be for you to not be able to distinguish between them. But at a reading distance, we can roughly distinguish 150 lines per inch. And what this means is that if you have black lines on a white paper and you put 150 of those, you can then, if you have more than 150, they start to blur together. So 150 lines is where our eye can differentiate and see those lines clearly. But the lines, in between them, we have white as well. So that's why if you double the lines, meaning 300 black and white pixels next to each other, we can see. And that's why we put the optimal resolution for print at 300 dots per inch. So then you can, of course, recalculate this to millimeters and centimeters, but all printers and everybody discusses this in inches just from old habits. So when you take an image and want to scale it to how big it can be on your printed poster, you should divide the format, in this case 3000 times 3000 pixels, divided by 300. And you see that this can then become 10 inches at each side. And that is the optimal size where you can see all the information in the image, but it is as sharp as you can make it. So when you take these two that looked perfectly fine on the computer screen and print them, you see one of them can only be this panel on an A4 and the other one. But then it comes to the question, so should I always use the maximum resolution of my CCD camera or on the confocal that I have? Is more always better? And the answer for that is, of course, no. And the reason for this is different if you compare a camera to a confocal microscope or something else. So if we start with the camera, you have to think about how the camera is taking this image. And the camera has two different layers in the chip that is acquiring the photons from the surrounding. One part is a very analytical cell that is analyzing the number of photons that come in. And the photons that come in there do not have other properties. They don't have a wavelength or anything else. It's just a measurement, a photon or not a photon. So all of these cells are blind to color. They see a grayscale. And what this means is that our CCD chips are always most sensitive if they are black and white, because then these can be bare, all of these pixels in them, and they can take all the light that comes in. So if you need a high sensitivity CCD camera, they are always black and white. And this is the reason, because the detectors in the chip are always black and white. But then, of course, we want to see color. And we can do it in two ways. Either we have a filter that we put on top of the whole chip, and that could be either a red filter, green filter, or a blue filter, that only lets through the red light for one. And so you acquire the red channel, then you switch the filter for the next, and you take the green and the third one for the blue, and then you put them together. And this is fine if you have something that is not moving. Then you can make that composite of the three. And it means that you get the maximum resolution in all three colors, and those filters can be optimized to let through as much light as possible. But the reality is that the sum of those three will never be as much as all the light coming in. You always lose light. So it will always bring down the sensitivity compared to not having a filter. But it can still be a rather good filter. But then in our smartphones or in our compact cameras, we don't want the object we're taking to always have to stand super still. We need to take moving images as well. So then came the idea of the Bayer pattern. So this was developed by a guy named Bayer, and that's why the name came up. And what he observed is that the green light that we see is the middle of the color spectrum. So we have blue on the shorter wavelength and red on the longer wavelength. But the green is in the middle, and green is where our eye also has the most detail and the most sensitivity. So he decided that half of these pixels he put green filters on. And then a quarter of all of them he put red, and a quarter of them he put blue. So then they're put in this pattern so that 4 of these green either have a red or a blue inside them. And this is important to know that when you're taking an image, the green channel will have double the detail as the red and the blue channel. So you want to make sure that things are centered around that to get the most detail. But it also means that your image never has the real resolution that you see in the specifications in the image. So in red and blue, you always have half the detail as you would in the green channel. So to make sure that you actually get as much detail as you think, it's actually better to have double the resolution compared to what you print. So if you want to print in 300 dots per inch, if you acquire with this Bayer pattern color CCD at 600 dots per inch, you know you get all the detail that you can bring out of that image. But things are not the same when we think about taking images with a monochrome CCD. Then you can have it at 300 dots per inch and those 3 channels together, and you will get all the information. And when you think about fluorescence or especially confocal microscopy and Western blot data that you acquire also with similar technology, it is not as simple as optimizing it for 300 dots per inch, because your quality of the image comes from multiple aspects. One is the number of pixels that you can see, and another aspect is signal to noise. And noise is something that every digital equipment we acquire data with has. So it has more or less of this noise. And the weaker the signal we're trying to detect, the more noise plays into it. So for those of you that work with digital Western blotting, you know that the CCD cameras in them are very low resolution. And they are low resolution because they are trying to make these pixels as large as possible. So the signal quality is the thing we can optimize as much as possible. Of course, noise we try to bring down by different technologies. The signal is directly proportional to the area of each pixel that we are detecting with. And so if you go from an image that is 300 dots per inch and go down to 150, what you're actually doing is making your pixels 4 times as large. And then you're acquiring 4 times as much of photons into each pixel. So if your noise stays the same, your signal increases 4 times. And to think about this in your confocal imaging, to make the same thing through this line averaging, you would need to do that 16 times to do the same thing. So increasing pixel size is the best way you can do to increase signal. So if you have something weak, it may be much better to focus on getting a lower resolution that is just enough for you to have in your published image, but to get more signal into it. So it's a combination of these things that will, in the end, bring the quality of your image. Yes? No. This is why you can make an average of multiple images. So noise can be 2 things. One is this random noise, which is sort of black currents that come in the flow of electrons inside the chip. And they vary. So they would be in one pixel one time and in another one another time. Another type of noise is more pixels working in the wrong way. And they are called these hot pixels or dark pixels. You can sometimes see them on a computer screen also that they are just not working well. So either they shine super bright or are completely black. And this other noise is not variable. So that type of noise you need to take away in the CCD chip. And it's actually done in many cameras, but you just don't see it. Because when you try to cram these 20 million pixels into a small CCD chip, like on your cell phone, there will always be multiple of these pixels that are not working. And that type of noise is taken away, and it just interpolates what's around it. So it masks that for you. So the other thing that it cannot handle is this random noise. And the way you can get around random noise is to take multiple images, and the only thing that will be constant between those is your real signal. And this is what's called the averaging of those. And that's one way to reduce noise. But it's so that it goes down by 1 divided by 2. So in the first average between 2, you halve your noise. But the next one will only bring a 4th lower noise. So you, after going 3-4 times averaging, you gain very little with the next ones. So that's why increasing pixel size is a much more efficient way of going than doing averaging. But normally you want to do both. To do a little bit on averaging, a little bit on pixel size, and then to find this optimal middle. And that also depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for small spines on a dendrite, you may have to cram your resolution super high, but it always comes at a cost of signal. And the third aspect in many of these measurements is also something we consider dwell area and dwell time. And I don't have a good image of this, but if you think about the type of analysis we do, and I bring up the confocal microscope a lot here because it's quite illustrative on it, that when you have a laser that has to shine on an area, the number of photons or particles that it can excite is also dependent on the area you shine on with the laser. So the lower resolution you have on your image, the larger area your laser can shine on. So you get double effect of increasing the pixel size in a confocal image because you can also have the area of the laser shining on a larger one. And then the third aspect is dwell time. So normally you have a scanning frequency which is sort of 200 hertz or 400 hertz. And that has to be divided on all the steps that it wants to go on this confocal image. So if you have it at the same frequency but only cover half the number of pixels in a line, it means that the laser can stay on each pixel there double the time. And then you also get double the number of photons excited. So there is a triple win in confocal microscopy of lowering resolution. So that is one of the places I would say that you don't want to go higher resolution than you absolutely have to. But of course, you need to think about every use case for that image. So the next thing is that because of this complexity with pixels, we want to use pixels as little as we can. Because pixels is a destructive thing. If you take a 300 dots per inch image and you rescale it to 150, and then you try to bring it back to 300 dots per inch, you cannot do that. So once you have thrown away data, you can never bring it back. There are algorithms that can help you to approximate, but they will never be the same thing as what you had in the beginning. So that's why we have something completely different in our computers as well, and that is a numeric representation of a shape. And this is why it's called vector-based fonts or vector-based graphics. And a vector, as you probably know, is something that has an origin and a direction and a size. So it has three different parameters to it. So it has orientation and a coordinate in space, can be 2, 3, 4 dimensions. And then it has a size, meaning either intensity or length of this vector, and then it has a direction. And this we use also to be able to capture shapes and images in a non-destructive format. So if you look at these ABC up here, on this screen, they look almost identical. But if you scale it up like this, you see clearly that they look different. And this is then a pixel-based one that is here shown at 72 dpi. And 72 dpi was the usual resolution of a computer screen. That is now becoming a bit more blurry because we have some computer screens are actually 4 times that resolution. And they are in the Apple universe, it's called the Retina displays. And we have those on the iPhones, the iPads, and also on the Retina MacBook. They have then a much higher resolution that is over 200 dots per inch. But many of the standard laptops and actually all larger computer screens are much lower resolution. There will come all of these Retina displays with time, but it takes more time the larger the display is. So this is why 72 dpi was the considered resolution for showing on a screen. And then we have the second one here, the 300 dots per inch, meaning that I can expand it within this 72 dpi, roughly 4-fold, and still maintain a good resolution of that image for viewing online or on the screen. But a vector-based font like this doesn't have a resolution. So regardless on how large you make it, it looks perfect on a screen or printed. You never lose any quality by scaling it down or scaling it up again. So that's really the beauty of vector graphics and why you want to make sure that you maintain everything you can in this vector space. If it can be generated in that space, you want to capture it there and maintain it all the way to publication. I'll describe to you why it's important to keep it also when you submit it to the journal, but we'll get back to that later. So for this part, there are a couple of take-home messages that want you to remember, so that, and it is these resolutions that we talk about, 72 dpi on a screen, and to know that what looks good on a screen will not guaranteed look good on a printed. That you need to always look at this higher resolution and aim for the 300 dots per inch. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you keep that when you capture your images. And even with confocal images, you don't need to push it to 300 dots per inch. But make sure that you're at least at 150. If you're lower than 150, people will really see those pixels and appreciate this as a very low resolution. But then it's a risk of stressing this 300 dots per inch is that we start to think that everything will look great as long as it's 300 dots per inch when we print it. And that's not actually true. That if you take some text and you render it at 300 dots per inch, black and white, and you print it, it will look jagged. And this is because our eye, although it can start to blur things when they come too close to each other, as long as there are borders, we can have a much higher resolution. And this comes from this lateral inhibition that probably all of you have read about in the retina, that we can start to actually exaggerate our borders. And text black and white is really that typical thing where the eye can start to focus resolution on areas, and then it will look jagged. So when you print, if you have to print something pixel-based and it's these line art or text and things, 300 dots per inch is not enough. So you need to go absolutely minimum 600 dots per inch, and if you can, 1200 dots per inch on these things to really make them soft. But for vector graphics, you don't need to bother with that. So fonts, if you maintain them as vectors, they will print at 1200 dots per inch if your printer can manage that. And most printers can manage more than 300 dots per inch just because they want to print text smoothly. So they are minimum 600 dots per inch and normally 1200. So then the last one there is then to really retain text and graphs and things in this vector format. So I thought we could have some more questions at this point. Are there any of these things that do not make sense, or everything crystal clear? Yes? Yes. No, you can. Absolutely. Yes. I'll show you how to do that. And this is one of the key things with Illustrator that you can. Any other questions? Nope. Then we'll get into exactly that point. So bringing back these ABCs and showing these ABCs at 72 dpi, you need 1100 pixels to describe this B here. So just showing all of these, and they have to be black and some are gray to manage to make this soft. So there's a lot of information just required to show a B on a screen. But then when we start to try to describe this as vectors, so the first one here is taking this one, just trying to make that look as similar as possible with just 28 points and straight lines between those 20. And you see already at 28 points, you can start to appreciate what letter it is. And if you make it small enough, this may in some cases actually start to look quite okay. And even 59, if you look at it small, then that would be fine. And when we're up to a tenth of this information, it looks really smooth. And then you can start to add points in this. And at this point, it is looking perfectly, 227 points. And there are only straight lines between these. So if we can then add another parameter, and that is curvature. So if you think about a point, and from between those points, we can start to describe how this curve looks. Then we can get the same softness as this with only 28 points. So if you compare this to this, it's quite the dramatic difference. And the only difference between this one and this is that we can now describe how the curve is in between. That these are only straight lines. But then the last one here has a single point. And that point is down here. And it only has now 4 parameters. It has the origin in space, this one here. The second one is which letter it is. The third one is what font it is. And the fourth one is the size. So you can, by then thinking about this being, it shouldn't be 1, then we can call this 4. You can actually show the exact same thing. And that is by using a font. So what the font is just this one being put in a library that you can pick out. And this means that if you use a B multiple times in a text, which we normally do, you can bring out the same copy and just paste it in those places. So typeset is just Bezier curved text, but it's put in the library and then brought back in the right place. And this means that we can always go to this one if we want to change our B shape or something else. You can always bring in that and put it in the same. So you can do a whole thesis or a book with all being of this vector graphic. But the computer would need to work much, much harder on displaying all of this if they were put with the real shapes in, compared to being put with a reference to the font. But it is really the same thing. So you shouldn't think about fonts being something unique you cannot touch. It is just there for you to work quickly and efficiently on the computer. But once it's printed, these are put in place with all of these points and the bends, and then they are put into pixels and printed. So it goes through all of these steps, but they are automated or optimized in your printer so you don't see it. But it's an important aspect that we'll get to also how to publish your data, that you can use this way to make sure that what you see on your screen will be the thing that is printed, because this is a major. So as I said, this is called the Bezier curves. And what it means is that you have a point and you have the length of the vector, meaning that it can describe how this bend should be. And you can actually make a curvature like this just by knowing the direction here and the direction here and the length of those. So that is the vector that we are using. Otherwise, this is just point. These are no vector, because each of these points do not have a direction or a size. But these points. And that's the beauty of how Illustrator works. So the next thing is to think about how do we use this creative suite, and why is it called this suite? Because we actually try to use them together, and they are designed in that way that none of them can manage your whole workflow. So it's not possible to have one software and say, well, I like InDesign. I'm going to do all my work in InDesign. That cannot be done. You need to have Illustrator for some things. You need to have Photoshop for other things. The only one that you can roughly get by with is, unfortunately, Photoshop. So some people learn Photoshop and they use that for everything. And that is, of course, one of the parts I want to push for not doing. So in this course, what we're going to try to do is to focus on these 3 software tools. And the bridge we will have for some aspects that is very useful. But there will actually be no usage of Photoshop whatsoever. And the reason for this is actually when you think about the workflow, and this is just trying to show how, when I generate papers, how sort of what things come in, how they are used, and what's output in the end. So we have here is, of course, where we generate our numerical data. We have our Excel spreadsheets, we have our SPSS statistics, we may get data from measurement machines like our qPCRs, and we may then do sort of flowcharts and other things. But in some cases, we may also want to reuse illustrations that have been published in PDFs. And of course, not for your own original data, I would hope, but at least there are cases when you want to present in a journal club, you want to bring in illustrations that come from a paper, clean them up, and present them in a nice way in your PowerPoint or Keynote. So that may be input. Another thing is that PDF is a great vehicle for moving illustrations and graphs and things from your measurement computer into the tools that you use for designing your figures. So PDF can both be input data, but it can also be output. So in the end, of course, we want to generate files that may be PDFs, but this may be intermediate that in some cases, the qPCR here is a good example of that. So qPCR is, of course, measurements of intensities with time. So they are points that then make up these sort of different curves. So it's inherent vector-based graphic. But still, the software package that is generating this data is not very clever. And this is one of the things we have to live with, that in science, it is not, they don't have the resources that Microsoft or Apple has to make their software, which means that the software we use there is always second-rate quality. They're not the most flexible software tools. So in that case, the only thing you could export was a TIFF file, getting these pixel-based traces out of your qPCR. But a way I'll show you is how to get around this is actually to print to a PDF file. And then you can generate a PDF that has all the vector information that the software package had, and you can go into Illustrator and clean this up and use all of that data. And there are many software tools you can use this sort of backdoor to get out the real vector graphic data that we have in that software. So this is one place where we generate data that will come. And all of this, the aim is always to maintain vector-based data or Bezier curved data. But there will always be cases where the source is pixel-based data. So if we take images from our fluorescence microscope and other things, they will be pixel-based. And my arguments that I'll get back to is that in many cases, Photoshop does not have to be on this line. So you want to make sure that you generate your data in high quality, bring it into InDesign, and then, only then, you may need to bring it back to Photoshop to do some adjustments. But don't have it as a routine to go always say that as soon as it's pixel-based graphic data, I would go via Photoshop, because you don't need to, and in many cases, this will make more harm than it helps you. And then, of course, we have text. When we do figure legends, when we do all of this lettering and other things, and that should also directly go into InDesign. So just to, in your own mind, to help you to know what the difference between Illustrator and InDesign is that InDesign is a multi-page software. So it can be used from anything from generating a single panel up to generating a 1,000-page book. It's very scalable in that way. And it's the best software you use to get in these pixel-based information. So if you work too much having pixel-based information into Illustrator, you don't have an optimized workflow. So because this software is not very good at using photographs, cropping them, putting, aligning them, and these kind of things. InDesign is much better at doing that. So if you have only a single illustration, you may only do it in Illustrator. But if you have an illustration that sits together with photographs, it's better to use them in tandem. So you make the illustration in Illustrator, and then you put it into InDesign. These arrows I've made into a single direction arrow, but that's really not the case. This is very bidirectional, and this is very fluid. So InDesign has this ability to link everything into it. So you can put in your first draft of your illustration into InDesign, and then you can go back and edit it, and it will automatically update into this InDesign file. So it can be the container of all your data, on the photographs of your illustrations and other things. And it can be fluidly updated. And it can even be done so from these parts. So this is why, I mean, you should get them into your final page in InDesign as soon as possible. And if you need to do adjustments or even replace the image, you can do that on the original data and it will automatically update into it. They are different file formats. So this will be a .ai file that is linked into this file. So that will be the container. So, but it can be shown here why you work in. So it's just, this uses its own file and then a folder of all the images that are put into it. And this is what gives you the ability to experiment and adjust things once you see them. Yeah. No, but you can in this case. It's done in that way that it is actually not touching the original file while you're using this. And that's another great advantage, that when you show your InDesign file, it doesn't show the original resolution of all your images. It just shows the resolution that's enough to show it well on your screen. But it keeps the reference to these original files. So if that's a 1 gigabyte photo file, it just makes a very small low-resolution JPEG that it keeps in here. But it keeps track of that file. So it doesn't actually keep it open. It just keeps reference to this and shows a low-resolution alternative. But then in the end, when you want to generate the final high-resolution figure, it brings everything together. So these are really at the core, and that's why I felt that in this course we'll focus on these guys. But there will be some work done also using the Acrobat to show you how that fits into the workflow. But in my view here, Photoshop is just one tool as all the other tools here that you use as part of data generation. So it's not on the principal path. And I have many figures that have never touched Photoshop. And I think that is a big advantage. So let's see. Yeah, good time. So why am I having this hate speech against Photoshop? And it's because it's one of those things that is so attractive to use, that you start to use it, and the more you use it, the more you know it, and you use it for more and more things. And it can do a lot of things. But many things it doesn't do very well. And the other thing is that you may start to replace the real thing you wanted to do with this proxy and cleaning up things in Photoshop, instead of thinking why this wasn't very good from the start. And that, I think, always gives you bad quality. So when you think about what people use Photoshop for, it's sort of this dust removal is, of course, one thing that some people do. White balancing, contrast brightness on images is another very used thing. And cropping and rotating images. I guess most of you would recognize these things for using in Photoshop. And then changing the size of it and annotate. Then we have specific things that come with the microscopy. You want to insert these scale bars and then putting lettering. And then in the worst case, people start to put multiple panels of photo next to each other in Photoshop. So I wanted to divide these things up just for the discussion a little bit and say the first parts here are actually things that you do not want to use Photoshop for the reason that they are much better done at the start when you acquire your images. So the first one is obvious, that if you clean your specimen before you acquire the image and clean the microscope, the image will always be better because you cannot reintroduce something that is covered by dust. And it also is one of these ethical things. How much can you actually go in and clean up an image? And if you do it cleaning on the specimen, you're completely guaranteed that it's ethical. It's ethical to make your data or your specimens as clean as they can be. The other part here has to do more with that we want to optimize the technology we use. So if you think about an image where you have a wrong white balance, and in a bright field microscope, the white balance comes from the voltage you put on your light. And it's similar to what you think about light outside versus light inside. So if you have a digital camera that doesn't have auto white balancing or does it badly, just takes the image as it sees it, you would see the image being completely yellow when you're inside and being blue when you put on a flash and looking okay when you're outside, especially when it's cloudy. And this is the white balance, and it comes from the color temperature of the light that we illuminate ourselves with. And so if it's a very high voltage of the lamp, for example, in a flash, it's a blue light. And if it's a candle light, it's very low temperature and therefore very yellow. And the same thing comes with the microscope and the light source in that. So you want to make sure that the light source is giving the best light it can be, and that is in the white. And there's a specific light temperature. On every microscope, you can find that. Normally, it has a small camera symbol or something like that. And that means that when you put the voltage at that temperature, it gives you a white light. And why is that important? It is to do with the aspect I talked about on the CCD chips, that they are differently sensitive in the red and the blue and the green, and in the green area, which is in the center of the color spectra, has the best detail. So if we can make our images as white as possible, meaning evenly distributed over this color space, you will get a much better original image to work with. And the same thing comes with the contrast and brightness, that if you can set all of this before you acquire, you're much better off getting a high quality. So really try to do that first, because crap in is always crap out. You cannot do magic on things, even though it may look like that. So here. And then the other point about this is that adjusting these basic concepts of the image are always much better done in the acquisition software that you have, rather than bringing them into Photoshop. And part of this has to do with bit depth, color depth of the image. And this is one thing that is a bit more of a complex area. And I wonder if I put a slide on this. No, I did not. And it has to do with how many of these small bins of data that we divide the color space up into. So when we were discussing this sound wave, you saw all of these small bars that it was giving a data point. And these bars, the width of them, you can make them more and more narrow. And the original data depth was called 8-bit. So when you acquire images, you will often see 8-bit color. And what this means is that we have 256 grades of green, 256 levels of red, and the same of blue. And if you take these three together, it becomes then 8 to the power of 3 there. And then it becomes, 256 times 256 times 256, which is 16.7 million colors. So by having 8 bits in these three and combining together, it gives you 16.7. And those 16.7 million sound like a lot, and it is a lot when you look at all the color range. But then if you take an image and you underexpose it, so you have an image that is much darker than you wanted it to be, you're not using all of these 16.7 million anymore. You may divide it only to half or maybe a third. If it's very underexposed, you squeeze all of that data into a third of the whole data range. But then you want to adjust it out to be the perfectly adjusted image. So you stretch this small data set and you stretch it out to cover all the 16.7. But you cannot fill in the data that is missing in between. So you get a stretch of all of that data to fit those data points. So then you will lose a lot of quality. And this is one of the reasons why you really want to make sure that you make the correct brightness of your image before you acquire it. Because if your software can only handle 8-bit color, that's the only range you have to work with. And you want to make sure that you stretch it to span all of these 8 bits. But then with newer cameras, the CCDs in them can measure at a much higher accuracy than 256 at each color. And those are now called then 10-bit or 12-bit or 16-bit color that you can take in the image in. And that means that when you have it in this underexposed and stretch it out, it has all of these points in between that it can put in the 16.7 million colors that we can see. So then you can actually have all of that information but squeezed in a much smaller region. So if your software can capture in this higher bit depth, you're much better off to use those than using 8-bit. So try to see that in the software. You can often there's this just a setting in the preference saying if it's 8-bit or 10-bit or 12-bit. And it really is a big difference between 8 and 10. So that can make all the difference if your camera can. And some software can capture in 10-bit but only export in 8. And that's why you're much better off if you can adjust these things, white balance, contrast, and brightness in the original software. So even though it may export only at 8-bit, you have done all of this stretching and adjustments before you export it out. So try to do all the rough corrections there. And then don't touch the image. Don't do any of these things in Photoshop, because these things are much, much better done in design and also being done afterwards. So one of the sort of clear examples around this that may not be obvious in the beginning is the cropping and rotating of an image. Because if you start to crop it before you know where it's supposed to go, you may actually in the end say, oh, okay, I made it into a square, but in my final layout of this image, it would have been much nicer if this was a rectangular figure. And then you don't have that extra information on the side. And if you then chose not to crop it in Photoshop and do it in InDesign, you have all of that data, but it's hidden. So in InDesign, it crops your images, but it maintains that extra information. So if you need to adjust it, you can always expand that part again. Rotation is a little bit more tricky to understand, but if you think about a square pixel and you adjust your image a couple of degrees, this square pixel does not rotate with it. So what it has to do is then to generate new square pixels that are then trying to fit in your original information in this slightly rotated image. So just taking a photograph and rotating it 1-2 degrees can bring your resolution in that photograph down to roughly half. You lose a lot of detail through rotating an image. So the first thing you want to do is trying to never have to rotate. So try to adjust it beforehand. And many microscopes actually have their stage you can rotate it a little bit. And that helps you if you can do that beforehand. But the other thing you can do is to not rotate in software, but rotate it in InDesign. And what InDesign then does is exactly this, keeping these square pixels and just putting an angle on them. And then it maintains all the information, but just shows the image rotated. And then you can crop it square. And then you can really optimize all of this, so your viewing angle. So try that and see how well it works. I think you will be surprised how much extra flexibility you can get through not going through Photoshop and cleaning this up beforehand. Another argument is there that often when you want to adjust this fine-tuning of your white balance and other things, the only place you can see if they are correctly done is by placing them next to each other. So you may not see that one is much more yellow than the other one until you have them in the multi-panel figure. And then you see, oh, this one is yellow and this one is bluish. And then you can go back to the linked file and adjust it, instead of trying to adjust them when you take them one by one. So that is also done best in the end. And the other parts here are clearly so that because Photoshop is a pixel-based software. So what comes out is always based on pixels. And all of these things, you really do not want to have them as pixels. You don't want to have scale bars and lettering on the images as pixels. You want to have these adjustable. And also, the photo montages are much better if they are maintained as a single image. And these things will become clear when I show you how these are converted into the final PDF of your, when you publish it in a journal. So if a montage that's made in InDesign will look dramatically better in the PDF from the journal compared to one that's done in Photoshop. Right, so I think that could be a very good place for our break. So we should have the coffee coming. If it hasn't come, they should be in 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can have a 20-minute break. Now when we had some sugar, I thought we can start with some of the driest information, and that's discussing file formats. It's not the most sexy topic, but it's one of the things that's always good to know a little bit about. So when we're talking about these file formats, many of them have the same origin. And with files, you have two ways of looking at the file. One is just the content of the data that is inside. So in a pixel-based file, you have each pixel has its identity, where it's located, what intensity of each color it has. Those are very straightforward. But when we have all of this vector information in a file, we need to have many more parameters into it. And these file formats came about from the programming area. So they were actually made for printers to understand information. And the first file format that came out is called the PostScript. And it's when you see files with .ps in the end, you know that this is a PostScript file. And PostScript was developed by Adobe to be able to have laser printers being able to print types. So in this file format, you can compare it to this HTML file format that we see on the web. So it's through programming describing how the page looks. So it has identities how the page is formatted, where headings are, where other text is, where images should be. And this PostScript format can then have images in it as well. And that makes it possible for us to print both images and text at the same time. So this .ps file, you will see sometimes popping up, but you normally don't have that as a file format that you work with. So it's mainly why I brought it up here is that it is the origin of all the other file formats that I'll describe next. So the one that you will see, and actually is one of the sort of workhorses when it comes to exporting pictures for publication, is the encapsulated PostScript. So this is very closely related to the PostScript file format. And the thing that it has is that it contains the images and the vector graphics together. So that's the same as can be in here. But it does not contain any font or any information about multiple pages together. So it only contains one figure panel and how that is sized. So you can put that EPS on the A4 page and generate a PostScript file again, but this would not have any page information. So when you use this EPS format, you need to be very careful with how you work with your fonts, because it's very easy that you end up with a file there that looks perfectly fine on your computer, but then when you move it to another computer, it gets totally disrupted with the text. It flows differently. It looks very differently on other computers. And there are ways to get around that I'll show you later on. So from this, you can see that there clearly needs to have another file format, one that can keep whole page information, that can keep multiple pages, and also retain fonts within it without needing to have the fonts separate. Because if you think about the articles that you download in the PDF, you don't have to download the fonts separately, although every journal has their own fonts inside and they look differently. And this is because the portable document folder format, PDF, is this container. So it keeps images inside, it keeps fonts inside, and all of this layout of multiple pages. And it can also compress the images in it. And this is why PDF files can be so small. The journals like it because you can also copyright protect and copy protect all of these PDF files. And that makes some hurdles sometimes when you want to use PDFs for other purposes. Then, so PDF is a great universal format that you really can use for a lot of things. But for Illustrator, there was a requirement to add some extra information into the file. And you can think of that being sort of having layers in the file and some transparency information and other things that are not suitable to be put into the PDF file. And this has made a .ai file. And it's really similar to a PDF file. You can see that on the Mac, for example, if you have Keynote, you can insert both PDF images and .ai images with perfect quality, because this file actually contains a PDF file within it as well. And that can be used separately. And this has the advantage that you can also link images, not putting them directly inside a file and so forth. So you want to make sure when you look for file formats that your analysis software can export, if you see file formats like these, they are your main go-to file formats. If you can export as EPS or PDF, you have the highest chance of retaining all the information that you can see in that software and make it that you can adjust them afterwards. Then we have a new one that is a bit of an odd one, but I brought it in here because we see this more and more, not least that this is the default graphics format for Wikipedia. And this is a vector graphics format that is developed for the web. So we can have on a home page having scalable vector graphics being inserted just like it was a pixel-based graphic. And this one is then now supported by most of the browsers. And you can actually bring those files into Illustrator and adjust them and play around with them. So that's also a useful format in that sense, but it's not one you want to export to. But I thought it should be here for completeness. Yes? Mm. I will show you that later on, hands-on, because that's a very good question. There are some ways to do that. So then, when it comes to these pixel-based file formats, it's important to know which ones are destructive and non-destructive. And here I use non-destructive should be with quotations, because they are destructive in the way that you generate pixels out of your text. So in that sense, you can destroy your vector information. But where they are non-destructive is the way it retains pixel-based information. And this is the key thing, because many of the file formats that we use, for example, if we go back here to JPEG, this is the main one you would use as a destructive file format. And destruction is sometimes good, because destruction can get rid of things that are not the main necessary information. And the other one that is more easy to understand is MP3. So MP3 for audio is destructive in the way that it throws away a lot of frequencies that are not in our sort of the sensitivity range that we hear most. So high frequency, low frequency MP3 files throw away all of that information. And by doing that, you can have much smaller files. The same thing is with the JPEG, that it is getting rid of some of color information, some of the details in the image that are very difficult to store in an efficient way. And it can make the files very, very small. You can often get rid of 90–95% of the size of the file. So it's super efficient in the way to store. But you need to know that this is destructive. And destructive can sometimes be fine. So if you have a PDF file that you get from the journal, all the images in it are JPEG images. And they look perfectly okay there, and it's fine to use it as your final image format. But why it is really something you want to avoid in your workflow is because when you save it once as a JPEG, you throw away 95% of the information. When you open it, you rebuild that information. So it sort of tries to interpolate between the information it has in it and builds a new file again. So it's from a 10% of the information, the image, it brings back 100%. And if you then take that image again and say you adjust something, just the brightness 1%, and you save it as JPEG, it has to compress again. But it didn't know how it compressed the last time, so it makes a new compression. It throws away 90% of the information. But it doesn't throw away the same 90% of the information. So if you would open a JPEG file, do a small adjustment, save it in JPEG, open it again, make a small adjustment, the quality decreases with every save you do. So this is why JPEG is such a bad format for your original files, because with every save, this file becomes worse and worse. So this is why you want to look for these formats when you work with a file. Once it's done and you don't want to do any adjustments on it, it may be perfectly okay to use this format. And I use that for the final images I present in my keynote, for example. Then it's perfectly okay because I know they are adjusted the way I want. I will not remake them. So I'm not saying that this is a format you should never use, but you need to take care to not use it during your workflow. And even in many cases, for example, if you have a camera that can only take JPEG images, the best thing is to save it in one of the other file formats while you work with it, and then make a JPEG in the end. Then you make sure that you at least don't make matters worse during your changes. So there are multiple of these guys, and they have their own pros and cons. The TIFF format is the most ubiquitous file format. You will see in most applications you can export as this. And this, by default, doesn't have any compression. So it is taking a lot of space. So even if you have a black dot in a big white space, that will be the same size as if there was random noise all through the image. So it doesn't care about the content of that image. So that is the least efficient way you can store any image, is in an uncompressed TIFF. Then there came this LZW compression to it, which is one of those things where you mathematically compress the image. So it's compressing it just like you would in a zip file where you put a lot of files together and it compresses the information in it. So it looks at patterns within the file and describes them more efficiently. So it means that the same image I talked about, the big white space with a black dot, can be much more compressed than one that has random noise all through it, because you can describe this is a white block and this is a white block and just focus on the black dot in it. So this file format is tricky because you cannot predict how large that file will be. You just compress it with that and you will see in the end how large it became. What is nice that because it's now outside patent, more and more software has incorporated it. So earlier on it was only Photoshop and other software that could read this compression, but now most software can actually read this. So saving in TIFF with this is your safest bet. Then you will get the best quality and having a balance where you don't waste too much storage. The thing that it cannot do is manage layers inside the file and transparency. So it will always be, you cannot have an object that's masked out to be able to lay on top of other things. So to do that, you need to go to either of these two formats. So the Photoshop file format is a proprietary file format that is made by Adobe. You have some software that has reverse engineered it so that they can read it, but it's not it's not the same thing. It's like reading a Word document. It works 90% of the time, but you cannot count on it. So it's fine if you just want to use it in other Adobe software, but maybe not as a general storage for all your data. This newer file format called PNG is a nice alternative because it can support transparencies. There is compression inside it, and it's a very nice format for screen viewing and putting in presentation. So I normally try to keep on this side, being here where I don't need transparencies and here where I need transparencies. And then you know that you have an open file format that every software can read, and also that you're non-destructive. So next, I thought we'll just go into some showing how these things work inside Illustrator. Just have a soft start of the Illustrator tool. And I'll try not to make this too boring, but it's often the things when you want to sort of demo on a computer that's difficult to make it very interactive, because it really isn't. But the first thing to understand with the Adobe software is that it's made by the same company, but not by the same people. All of the software, Photoshop, Acrobat, Illustrator, InDesign. So they have the same directions from the top, but the people that do them are not the same people. And this has some nuisance into it, because it means that they are 98% similar, but there are always things that work in one application but not in the other one. And the panel may look almost identical, but it differs slightly. And this is just the things you have to live with in the software. But they have some overarching things that are the same in all. So let me just create a document here. And they work in the same way that you have all of these palettes and tools. And they now have the same way where you can have different layouts. So let me just reset this one. Where you can have all the tools out dependent on how you use it. So you see in this one here, you can have your essentials. Let's see if I can show this one here. So you can have essentials layout for painting and for printing and proofing. And it tries to match the tools out that you want to use. But now we're just going to focus on the essentials. And the other thing that all of them have, but they all have slightly different tools, are these tools here on the left, where you have the pointers and arrows and different type of things for type. And many things you can guess, but in Illustrator, you need to understand that there are two selection tools. And they are part of the core in Illustrator that you need to get used to. So the top one is the selection tool that works very similar to the selection tool in all other software, that you select a full object and you can move that object around and scale it and other things. But then you have another one called the direct selection tool. So if I try to show you how this actually works. So we start by creating a square. So with the direct selection tool, you see that I can just move the square by taking at any place here. And I can actually, on the outside here, start to rotate this one. And you see now when I've rotated it, I have all of these handles that I can start to change the size of this whole square. But then the other selection tool is the direct selection tool. And when I change to this one, sorry, I took the wrong one here. You see that what is marked changes. So now in this square, you can see that these corners are marked, but not the middle here. And what this means is that when I select one corner, I now select only that so-called anchor. And it means that I can now take this corner of the square and move it around. So I can go in and fine-tune the shape of this square. While the selection tool works just on the whole thing. So I move this corner in, but then when I select the normal selection tool, I can then move the whole thing again. So sometimes you need to use one of the selection tool and sometimes the other. And I'll try to show you both of these. So in this case, if we go back to the square, I'll try to show you the difference between points and lines and the Bezier shapes. So in this case, the only thing you have are these 4 corner dots here. And so you have this corner, and this corner, and they have no other entity. They are only these corners, and they are joined by lines. But in the next step, you can actually go into this tool here. That's called the pen tool. And the pen tool has multiple of subparts that we'll go into in detail. But one is that I can now actually start to change this corner here into a Bezier curve. And now it has gone from being a point without other entities to have what you see, a direction and a length. So the direction is then the derivative of the slope at this point. So you see, when I move it around, the slope has different sloping at different directions here. And the length has to do with the softness of here. So you see, when I make it longer, this curvature goes out further and further. So you need both of these components to be able to adjust the slope in between. And now when I have it this horizontal, you see that actually it starts to become something that, in the end, you envision you could make into something that looks like a circle. So if I do it like this for all the 4 points, it's not very easy to do this correctly in the start. Like so. So you see that a circle is actually just the same thing as a square rotated 45 degrees, but having these handles out. And that's how this whole software works, that you have all of these called points and handles. And by doing that, you can make very complex shapes with very few points. And then with this, you can then go in and to add points in between. And by having more points, of course, then you can take that point and you can start to make this, I don't know what you want to do here, maybe a pear shape like that. And that's just another point to it. So it just has 5 points. And you can add more and more to this. So that is the main principle of this Bezier curve. So it's not very tricky from the start, but where it becomes tricky is because of this fact that they are not independent. So you see the one on the right side here is dependent on the left. So if I move the right one up, the left one moves as well. And you can use that to your advantage, but you will see when you start playing around with these that it can be a little bit frustrating. And this is why I would urge you to start actually working with primitives instead. So what are the primitives in Illustrator? And these are squares and rectangles and everything else. So you can, of course, make a rectangle in here with the rectangle tool. So that is a nice name for it. And then you have the ellipse tool that we can make then a circle from this point out there. And then, of course, you can make one which is the polygon tool. And you also have the star tool. So the polygon tool, to use that well, you need to also learn shortcuts and key commands in Illustrator. And key commands in Illustrator are mainly the ones that are down in your left corner of the keyboard. So you have Shift, you have the Option key, you have the Control key, and then you have either the Command or the Windows key, dependent on your operating system that you use. But the ones you want to focus on is the Shift key and the Alt key, Option key. So the Shift key is, so when I start drawing a rectangle like this, you have the proportions being totally flexible. But as soon as I press the Shift, you are then working with squares only. And that is the same thing if you work with a circle or the ellipse tool, that without shift, you have it totally free, and with shift, you use only perfect circle. The option key is useful when you want to do a circle like the one I did in here. When you want to use one that is, sorry about that. So if we want to make a circle that has its center at this point, I press the option key and I pull out. So now you see that it starts from that point and moves outwards. And then I can make an ellipse like this. Or I can combine it with the shift, and then you get a circle. And so you see, because this was a square, the other one, of course, it should also fit perfectly to that. So those two together are very useful. And then, in some cases, you will see that you wish you had 3 arms, because there are these commands that are not very simple. And in some way, you just have to learn the sequence of how you want to do this. And that comes with this polygon tool. So if I use the option to get started from the middle of this one, you see that, of course, now it can be in any direction. If I choose the shift, then it keeps a perfect direction like this. But now I want to be able to design the number of sides on this one. And for that, you use the arrow up or down. So this is where you need to sort of keep it pressed, and then you can use arrow upwards to add sides to this polygon. You can do that in another way also, and that is to just click on the artboard, and it will ask you the number of sides you want to make it and the size. And this you can do for all of these, so you can actually make a rectangle and just click once on the artboard, and you can then set exactly your width and height of this one. So you can have it 100 times 50 millimeters there. And then you get the exact size. So these primitive shapes are actually very powerful. You may think that you cannot get very far with these shapes, but in truth, you can do a lot of scientific drawings just by knowing how to make these primitive shapes. And the reason why you can do that is because you can actually start to combine shapes. So, for example, here, if I want to make this into a test tube, so I'll see if I can put some angle to this one. And to do that, I want to bring up some panels. And the first panel I want to show you is in here. And it is called the Pathfinder. The Pathfinder sits together with the transformation toolbox. And you see in Illustrator and all the other ones, you can tear these ones off. So you can see them all at once. And the Pathfinder is a very useful tool for creating a complex shape. So if we take this square, and I just choose to make a copy of it where I put, say, 25 degrees angle to that one, and I put it down here, make another copy, and make it, say, minus 25. Oh, sorry. I thought I put minus 25. So, yes, that is the option key. That's another very useful one. So if I just press the option key and pull one, I make a copy. So I can take these two now and just put them on top of the first one there. And Illustrator works in this way, that the things that are on top has priority over the bottom ones, so it is using them as a cutout. And then when you select all of these 3 here, you can have what's called minus front in the Pathfinder up there. So when I take those 3 and click that one, it takes the top 2 ones and just excludes them from the lower one. So you can easily, with this, sort of stamp out things from one shape to the other and make that into a much more complex shape. And the same thing you can do is that you can then make something like this, that you have 2 shapes, and you can use them together in a tool called Unite. So when I press the Unite, they are fused together. So then I can make something that could work up here, maybe like a lid. So you may then ask, well, what was the issue with keeping this as two shapes like that? Couldn't I just make those black? That would be the sort of quick and dirty way of doing this. The reason why you want to avoid having two separate shapes being one shape in your illustration is as soon as you come to more complex drawings and you want to make transparencies, for example. So if you make those two, let's see if I can mimic that here, that if I make these two into black, and then I decide to make these 50% transparent, you see that they are then, sorry, just fix this one. You see that overlap in a very unattractive way, compared to if you would then use the Unite tool and make them into one. They are still 50% transparent, and you see things through it, but they are not overlapping each other. So you want to use this Unite as much as you can to make into one more complex tool. So you see, you don't have to have any drawing skills to make this type of shapes. You just align and use all of these different shapes. And the alignment tool in Illustrator is another one, a very powerful tool. To understand the alignment, you need to also look at the transformation. And transformation in Illustrator is this box here. And you see that you have, and let me just select one of the things. There. It's so big. Go. So when you have selected something, you have 4 parameters of size and placement, and then you have rotation down here. So x and y is the simple just description of the coordinate of this, in this case, the test tube. And where it is taking this coordinate is dependent on this area over here. And this is where you put your reference point. And it's now being put in the center, meaning that it is describing the coordinate of the center of this vial. But if you move it to the top left, you see that the coordinates change, but the width and height of this object does not change. So you can set that I want the center of this one to be at a certain coordinate or any of the other points. These things in here are, sorry, that's not what I wanted. Yeah, now I have generated some nice things here. So, good with the undo. So, this type of scaling that you have in here is, sorry, I'm just trying to use too many commands. It's very flexible in the way that you see in my software here, it says millimeters in this units. But when you start Illustrator from the first time, it doesn't actually say millimeters. It calls points. But you can set that in the preferences to be millimeters, and I can show you how to do that tomorrow. Because I think that's the most intuitive way to start, is to show it as millimeters. But it doesn't mean that you have to work only with millimeters when it comes to the sizing here. So you can actually say that, no, I actually want this one to be, instead of 19 millimeters, I want it to be 1 inch high. And then it scales it to be 1 inch high. And you can still use points, and then you can do more intelligent scaling also, and being referenced to the original size. So I can say that I want this to be 30%, and then it takes the original size and makes it 30% of that size. And then you can also say that I want to have this exactly a third in size, and instead of writing 33.33%, you can say divide by 3. And then you get it into a third. And you can also say that I want to have 6.652 plus 5. And then it does all of that calculations in there as well. So these things are useful for scientific drawings because you can actually make things in scale. And in principle, you could make a full graph just using this and putting in the exact data points. So you can use it that way. Of course, it's not the most efficient, but there are clearly cases where you want it. To know the x and y coordinates in this drawing, you need to know where the point of 0 is. And to see that, you can show your rulers up here. And you now see that the rulers came up at the top point here. And you see that 0 is at this point. So you have 0 there, and on this side, if I show them there as well. But it doesn't mean that you have to have 0 up there. I can take this corner, and I can pull it to the top of this vial. And now, if we go to the transformation toolbox here, and select this vial and say the top left, it has the coordinate 0, 0. So that can also be useful if you want to work within a defined space inside this one and move things in those coordinates. So then you can adjust that. So those are the main useful things of the transformation toolbox. But this reference point has many more important things. So if I have this test tube and I want to start rotating it, it makes all the difference where I put the reference point. So if I have the reference point in the middle and I rotate this 45 degrees, it rotates around its own center point of gravity here. While if I do the other way around and say that I want to have the top left point and do the same rotation, it rotates around that point. So this reference point is really where you have to set before you do rotations and other things, where it should rotate around. Yes, exactly. So you can do that. You can do it the same way as I did before to put plus 45. And then it goes 45 millimeters to this direction. Or you can put the exact coordinates. So you can use the same maths in that as well. Another thing to understand in Illustrator is that illustrators can scale in two ways. One way is that you can scale so that the thickness of all the lines retains the same, or the other way it scales so that if you double the size, it also makes the lines double the width. And this is a little bit hidden. So it's in this menu here. You can say that you want to scale, stroke, and effect. So you can see the test tubes that I have here, if we take away the top one, they have all the same line thickness, even though I scaled them differently. But if I now have the selected scale, strokes, and effects, if I now say that I want to have this 250%, it makes the line 250% of its original thickness as well. So these have use cases, both of them, but it's important to know where to find that, and that is in this menu with the scale, stroke, and effects. So next, I thought we could look at alignment. And alignment can be done in two ways. So you saw when I put in this cap that actually it helped me to align. And it has these smart guides helping me to guess where I want to put things. And it guesses that I like symmetry and alignment. So when I put it up there, it aligns to the top of the vial like this, and then you move it in. And then it tries to align to the center. But sometimes it cannot guess that for you. So you need to also be able yourself to do this alignment. And then, fortunately, we have the alignment toolbox here. And alignment has the trick that you need to know where it's aligning to. And when you're aligning top and bottom, it's quite easy to understand that. So if you have these three, and you want to align them to the bottom, it will take the bottommost object and use that as the reference. So if I select all three, and then I use this vertical align button, it moves the other two down to there. The same thing if I do the top, it moves them up to here. But how should it do when I have it to the center? There's no easy right answer to that, and sometimes you want something differently than the software can guess. So if you do it without any more action and just press center, it moves all of them a little bit. And often that's not what you want. If you want to maintain, for example, that I want the middle one to not move, you need to select all three, and then you actually select the middle one once more. And you see that that becomes now double in this thickness of the selection. And then that's locked in space. So if I now do the alignment center, it moves the other two. And if I do the same thing but having the large one selected and align, then it moves the other two to that one. So this helps you to tell the computer which one should be your reference. And that can be the same way when you do the other two type of alignment. So if you align bottom and having one double selected like this, it will move the other two up, even though it would have by default moved them all down to the bottom of the largest tube. It now moves them all up. So this can be done both in the horizontal and the vertical axis. Then, of course, there are cases where you want to make sure that they are not only aligned, but then that the spacing here and the spacing here is the same. And this is in the same alignment toolbox, but you actually have to use this show options. So when you have that, you can select all three of them. And again, you want to select which one is your reference. So I say the left one. And now I can either press the horizontal distribute. And what it will do then is to move all of the objects in the middle, keep the two outer ones, and distribute the ones in between to keep the same distance. So if, no, not in this one. You should not have selected one as the reference then, because then you have to specify the spacing. So if you don't select any of them and do that, then it moves only the middle one. But as soon as you set one as the reference, then you get this option to specify the spacing. And this is why it looked like it did, because I have the specified spacing to be 0 millimeters, so it moves them all together. But then I can start to say that I always want these to be 4 millimeters spaced, and I get the perfect spacing. So this is something very useful when you do multi-panel layouts and things, where you want to make sure that all the spacing is the same. So then you use this one there. It is because when you set a defined one, it has to know. So if you want to give 4 millimeters distance, for example, you have to know which ones it should move and not the others. If you have it's 3 objects, it's not the best example here. If I take, let me just show you. It may become more easy if I show a couple more of them. So if you have all of these guys, and you just want to distribute them evenly, it will not move the outer two. So then when you press this one without having a second one selected, then it can just move the ones in the middle. There's no ambiguity in that. But if you want to say that now I want to have them 4 millimeters apart, it needs to know which one should stay in its place. So that's why you then need to say that in this case, I actually only want this one to stay in its place, and the rest should be 4 millimeters apart. And then I can do that. So then it keeps that one safe. Any other questions on that? Yeah? Mm-hmm. You can actually do both. If it's only graphs, I would probably do it in Illustrator only. And the reason why I would do that is because if you rescale graphs, now I'm a bit of a pedantic, so I like to keep my line thickness the same. And if you take them one graph by one and you put them into InDesign and you scale it there, it scales also the line thickness in design. It cannot do anything else because it sees it at one graph object. While in Illustrator, you can rescale them and then afterwards say that I want all of these to have the same line thickness. So it gives you that extra final adjustment possibility to, I know some people don't care, but I like to have them looking like that at least. Yes. I'll show you that actually either tomorrow or on next Monday. There is one place where I'll show you exactly how to do that. But there are many ways around that. So these were those toolboxes. Let me just see if I had some other notes on what we should do today. I think we have actually covered all that I have planned. So for the next step, now it is actually for you guys to get started with playing with these things. And that will come tomorrow morning. So then we'll, all of you that wants to get it installed can be here at 9. And then at 9:45, something like that, we'll go through more of sort of fine adjustments in Illustrator, getting started with that, going through the assignments a little bit more, and some other details to help you get started, how to start drawing something more complex. We'll start, I have two examples, one where I like to draw actually by hand first and get sort of sketches, scan those in and show how to draw on top of those. And the other one is to start from scratch on the computer. So we'll do that tomorrow morning, and then in the afternoon also Ludwig will come. So thank you all for coming.